I wanted to make a list of the major high civilizations. So there's Mesopotamian, and Mesopotamian civilization ends when the Indo-Aryan Persians conquer and absorb dying Mesopotamian civilization. Okay, you have Egyptian civilization. 400 is roughly when hieroglyphic writing stops. This is while Egypt is a Roman province. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've got Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and then you've got Chinese and Indian, both 1500 BC to the present. There's a real kind of parallelism there. Unlike Mesopotamian civilization, unlike Egyptian civilization, Chinese and Indian civilization still exist. They are, to use the term that you and I have discussed a lot, in a state arguably of suspended decrepitude. So you've got Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian. You've got classical or Greco-Roman. That's 1100 BC to 500 AD. That civilization ended when the Germanic barbarians conquered Rome. So Mesopotamian civilization was conquered and absorbed, kind of like the cyanobacteria being absorbed by a cell. Egyptian civilization
died a slow death.
Right. It sort of died without being conquered.
Like you say, the Mesopotamian civilization dies from being engulfed by the Indo-Aryan Persians, who then take over its culture forms to create the Achaemenid Empire, which Toynbee regards as yet another universal state coming out of that world. And he may be right. The first universal state being the Babylonians. So from the Babylonians, who were Semites, and the Sumerians were not. So they're Semites. And then we get the Assyrians, and then the Persians carrying that whole tradition on. With Egypt, it just dies a slow death of senility almost, because it's Theodosius the Great at the end of the 4th century who puts the death to it by anathematizing all paganism, and that includes Egypt, even though Greece had been revering Egypt forever as one of, as they thought was the oldest civilization in the world. They were close. So it died a slow death. Although I will say this, with respect to Egypt, its death blow is really the Sea Peoples. After 1100 BC, Egypt, it continues, but like we said before, it's a dead museum. It doesn't develop anything new. It just spends those centuries between 1100 BC and 400 AD reiterating its own cliches. So it's pretty much done after that point as far as creative vitality goes.
It was not absorbed in the way that Mesopotamian civilization was.
Yeah, exactly. So with the Persians, they just absorb it and take it over with this new world of conquest, with the Achaemenid Empire that the Greeks resisted. So
I didn't realize, but now as we're talking, I'm trying to come up with a sort of typology of death. So there's conquest and absorption. That would be Mesopotamia. Okay. With Egypt, obviously it's senility, but it's senility in part brought about by...
It's almost like a person who has a car accident, and then for the rest of their life, they're on painkillers, and it's just a slow, gradual, the Sea Peoples crashed into it like a car accident.
We might say something like military defeat followed by senility. Okay, so you've got China and India. They're still going. Classical / Greco-Roman. The barbarians are sort of like the Sea People, right? It's a sacking, it's a conquest.
Much more thorough in that case.
Right.
I mean, the 5th century, from 411 when Alaric first invades Rome, and then 476 when you got Odoacer on the throne there, a barbarian king, it's done. It just does not cease to, it's not even a dead museum anymore, it's just gone.
Partial sacking followed by senility in the case of Egypt, and then like thorough sacking in the case of the barbarians. And it's not followed by senility, you're just dead.
It's ghost hovers. Over the West and over the Byzantine world, it's ghost hovers.
One thing that makes Hellenic civilization so major is its influence, right? Because it hasn't lasted as long as many of the others, right?
It's a very powerful civilization. That's why, Charlemagne trying to revive the Roman Empire and the Renaissance trying to revive the Greeks. It's like the West looking up to an older brother. I want to be him. I want to do the stuff he does with his motorcycle, riding around and getting hot chicks. And, it's kind of like that. So its ghost is kept alive.
I mean, in many ways, it is at least in the Western hemisphere, the metaphysical and artistic apex. When I was in the Louvre, no room blew me away more than the Greek sculpture room.
I was just going to mention that. My personal story was going to the National Gallery in DC. And I just happened to have the good fortune. I didn't know this was going to happen, but I just happened to have the good fortune to be there when they were having a special exhibition on 5th century Athens art. I was like, oh, what's
Amazing.
this like? Well, let me go and take a look. Stunning. Absolutely. The words cannot describe what they managed to do with stone and made it just luminous with this spiritual, otherworldly radiance that I don't think any other culture has ever done. The Hindus came close, but then they were trying to imitate Greek sculpture because Alexander went over there and introduced them to sculpture in stone. But there's something really special about Greek art, 5th century Athens, that you'll never see again in your lifetime.
Do you think Spengler would agree that a more accurate or thorough way of describing the Apollonian Ur symbol, it's not just the body, it's the beautiful male body glistening in the sun or something like that?
That's true. But the one sculpture I remember that stands out, and I'll never forget it, was this beautiful, it was a relief sculpture, but very full relief, almost a three-dimensional sculpture unto itself, of a young girl with a dove. And it's just a girl sort of petting a dove. I'll never forget that in my life. It was just radiating with otherworldly luminosity. It was incredible. It was so delicate and light. And I can even imagine what would have been in the sculptor's mind as he was carving this thing and just making this sheer beauty come into this world. It's stunning. It's stunning. The Greeks are revered for a reason. They are not overrated.
And that's just the plastic arts. Then you've got Aeschylus and Sophocles and
here again, I'll throw in another personal anecdote. When I was living in Berkeley, I happened to have the good fortune to go see Aeschylus's three plays. They did it as one play, the Oresteia, and they did it as one play. So you go inside. It wasn't outdoors. So the Greeks would have done this outdoors, but you go in because we're Faustian. We like interiors. We like the depths. So you go inside. I sat down, and for about 2.5 hours, with all three plays were together for about 2.5 hours. It was stunning. It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life. It was almost Wagnerian in its impact. It was so intense and passionate, and it just punched you in the stomach with its brutality and its seriousness. And that's even if you don't know what the issues were at that time, with the rise of Athenian rationalism coming out of the mother goddess Chthonic nighttime cults of the dark earth and human sacrifice. That's really the tension going on there. And it was fantastic. I'll never forget it in my life.
One good entry point for understanding the role of the chorus is T.S. Eliot's Becket. It's modeled on a Sophoclean or Aeschylean tragedy, and you have a chorus, and it's a little more understandable to us because we know the historical references better, et cetera. Anyway, we've got Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, classical. Of those, Mesopotamian died through conquest and absorption. Egyptian died through partial sacking, followed by senility. Classical or Greco-Roman died by thorough sacking, followed by just being dead. Okay, then you got Magian, Abrahamic, monotheistic civilization, Arabian. We've got a lot of different words. Now, this is the first one where I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you. So, first of all, if you had to give a timeline of beginning of spring to death, or there has been no death. So Magian civilization, like Chinese and Indian, is still around. But the beginning of the spring, would you say 0 or 500? I think we
right around the time of Christ.
0, yeah, okay. What does Spengler say about the Jews? Are they even part of Magian civilization?
Yeah. I went back and I checked recently to make sure I got this right. And he does say that they are pre-cultural. He does. The Temple of Solomon on down is pre-cultural. And I was thinking, interesting, to think about the Temple of Solomon, because he says that the Pantheon is the first mosque and the worldview is that of a cavern. But let's think about Solomon's temple then, because it's basically a rectangular block, but it is all interior. It is a type of cave. You have to walk inside of it, and it's all an interior except a rectilinear interior, not a dome-shaped, not a uteromorphic form, to use Sloterdijk's term. So then, as Spengler is describing this, he says, the thing about Solomon's temple is that it's in between styles. It's not yet a mosque, but it's no longer a Babylonian ziggurat. It's in between. This is one of the characteristics of pre-culture. And he says this with Russia, about the very famous and iconic church there, St. Basil's Cathedral, which was built by Ivan the Terrible in 1555 with all the colorful cupolas and so forth. He says this too is a similar form. It's in between styles. It's not yet whatever it's going to be, and it's no longer a mosque. So interesting to think about this.
Do you think that the Grand Cathedral, the Great Cathedral to the military heroes, is one of the early expressions of
how it's going to go from henceforth? It strikes me as equivalent to our Gothic cathedrals, at the birth of the springtime, where the style is no longer in between. It's found itself. The Cathedral of the Armed Forces. It's found itself. It's very solid. It's very self-confident. Unlike St. Basil's, which is a little weird, actually. It's a little weird. It's tentative. But yeah, the Cathedral of the Armed Forces is mighty. It's grand. And it has all the confidence of springtime. And I'm sure that the Russians that will be like a central archetype that they'll just do variations on from henceforth. And it's got all these modern architectural aspects to it that, it's got metal reliefs inside of it. I think there are rooms where there are digital reliefs as well, incorporated into the, it's very modern. It takes up all these modern materials, metal, glass, incorporates them with these very traditional materials. It's really a marvel. It's electronic stained glass now with these digital reliefs that tell these stories about their victories over the Nazis, which is what it's meant to represent. The whole cathedral, a paean to the armed forces, to the victory over the Nazis. But it's funny because political art is the worst art in the world. So you would expect that to be total kitsch, but yet it's not. When you go in there, they don't really harp on that. There are reliefs showing that in digital reliefs, but the Christian Byzantine imagery is what predominates. It still retains its classical Byzantine iconic splendor. It's not kitsch at all. And they could easily have given way to kitsch, as the Nazis did with their neoclassical art, and as Soviet Russia did early on with the Soviet art, quote, art of the 20s and 30s, which is garbage. But they didn't fall into that trap. It's amazing. It's like something from another world.
When I saw the name of the cathedral, that did sound very lessening to me.
Yes.
But if Russia is in its springtime, the fight against the Hitlerian war machine, that could be a really seminal part of the founding story of Russian civilization.
It's like a crusade to them.
Yeah.
It's like a crusade. They conquered the infidel.
I think to understand the import of World War II anniversary celebrations in Russia, you'd have to take our V-Day and VJ Day and raise it to the 10th power. And my parents were in Russia, and their visit coincided with basically Remembrance Day of the sacrifice of Soviet troops in World War II. And they said there was something different in the air. One other thing I was going to say is that Soviet art and Maoist art is the most absurd example of art being subordinated to ideology, right? Like happy peasants in the field, so ridiculous. But I've mentioned this many times to friends. A few years ago, Lafayette College invited someone whose name I can't remember, but she was advertised as a social justice comedian, subordinating comedy to political ideology.
Well,
right?
It doesn't work. The whole point of comedy is to subvert. To subvert. That's the whole point. Think of George Carlin. That's the whole point. And going back to like the court jester that the king had. He had carte blanche to insult the king and his administration in any way he wanted.
I mean, what more evidence does one need that this ideology is totalitarian? I'm not trying to say that everyone who is sympathetic to social justice in some measure is a closet totalitarian, not at all. But these manifestations of the social justice movement, where you bring a social justice comedian to campus, it's so ham-handed and historically illiterate. Or you know the history and you're proud to be in that lineage.
I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy. I grew up on stand-up comedy. Steve Martin, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Robin Williams. They were heroes of mine. I grew up watching them, laughing at them, and they've been with me all through my life, especially thanks to YouTube, where I can pull up their stuff at will. Because back then, if you wanted to hear them, they weren't on television, or if they were censored. Richard Pryor on Johnny Carson is not funny. To be honest, he's not funny because he's censored. Richard Pryor has to be uncensored to be funny. And there were a couple of concert movies that did that. Or you went out and bought the record albums. You put the record album on, then you get the uncensored versions of them. And then I thought Louis C.K. was the last of a dying breed from that generation. He sort of evoked them. He managed to respect political correctness and still sort of find ways around it, to tunnel ways through it that would make you laugh. And it's really a tragedy what happened to him, because I think it was totally unfair, because he sort of accepted political correctness and was willing to work with it,
Right.
and figured out a way to make it funny anyway. And so I think it's really unfair what happened to him, because he's not funny now. I've listened to him since what happened. He's no longer funny. I have to say that.
So I don't know Richard Pryor that well. I know many consider him the greatest stand-up comedian of all time, but I'm very familiar with George Carlin and love George Carlin, but I actually think Louis C.K. may be the greatest of all time. I do think, though, that before he was canceled, he didn't simply operate within the parameters of political correctness. Sometimes I think he actually, and I would criticize him for this, rode the wave of political correctness, in the sense that, like one thing that is very fashionable to do is speak ill of white people. Mm-hmm. And I think ethnic humor is really funny, but one insidious aspect of political correctness, the successor ideology, whatever you want to call it, is that you can speak ill of white people, but not of any other group, right? And you can, make all these negative generalizations about white people, but not any other group. And you can celebrate the peoplehood of every group other than white people. There is a kind of like anti-whiteness near the center of political correctness and social justice. And I think that actually some of Louis C.K.'s material, he basically just accepts uncritically this version of history where white people are uniquely rapacious, right? But setting that aside, I'm basically a Louis C.K. completist. I've listened to all of his material and then some. I think he may be the greatest of all time. I've actually enjoyed his last two specials. I wouldn't say they're his best, but it's interesting that you see a real decline. I will ask,
he's too cautious now, where he wasn't before, and I think that's hobbled him.
There's a leaked set that you can still find on SoundCloud. This was pretty early after his cancellation. He did a set in Long Island, and it is very, very unpolitically correct.
I don't think I've heard that. No.
I'll send it to you.
Where do you? Oh, good. Yes, please do. Because I'm like you. I'm a Louis C.K. completist. I have to go through. Yeah. I went through everything that was on his site.
Yeah.
Bought every one of those videos. Yeah.
Last thing I'll say about Louis C.K. is I was living in the West Village for a little over a year. I don't anymore. I had a great time when I was living there. And one day I was in the dog park, and this was during COVID. And who approaches the dog park with his dog but Louis C.K.? And it was obvious
you had
it was
a sighting,
him. Huh? Yeah, it was obvious that it was him, even though he had his mask on. And I didn't want to be annoying, and I didn't want to draw attention to him, but I was leaving the dog park just as he entered, and I just looked at him. He looked back at me, and then I looked away, and I just said, "Greatest comedian of all time."
He heard that?
He heard it, and he said, "Thanks, buddy."
Nice. Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. Perfect encounter with a celebrity. You just want to acknowledge, but not bother them or inconvenience them and go away. It's perfect. Exactly. That's how you do.
All right, so we've got Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, classical. Okay, so Magian. I asked you what Spengler does say about the Jews, and he says they are part of Magian pre-cultural period, and then you talked about how...
Yeah. I do want to point out, because this is a point with regard to Mesoamerica, that given that, then, so the pre-culture period is 1000 BC for the United Monarchy with Saul and David, David and Solomon. So that's 1,000 years of pre-culture before you get to the springtime in that case.
Right.
Whereas he says with regard to Russia and the West, it's only 400 years from the Merovingian to 900, and same thing with Russia. So there's a much shorter pre-cultural period. And with the Mesoamerican civilization, which Spengler didn't know about, the Olmecs, because they were just being dug up in the 20s and 30s, but it's 1200 BC, and they last all the way down to the Classic period, which is 200 AD. The Classic period, which Spengler says, and I looked this up in The Decline of the West, he does have a couple pages on the Mesoamerican civilization where he says its springtime period begins about 200 AD, which is right where the anthropologists put the Classic period. Yeah. So that's 1,000 years there in that case as well. So that leads me to think that the Classic period is kind of formless. It's kind of, it's amoeboid. It can be short or long. It just depends. So that isn't so locked down where every century matters. Once the springtime gets going, every single century matters and corresponds closely to his morphology of 1,000 years. And then after that, when you get to the post-Classic period, then time starts to become negligible again. It's historyless. So it's really, so a way to resolve these like 3,000 year culture arcs, with India and China is to zero in on that 1,000 years in the middle that matters, where, the art's developing, finding its identity and its style, philosophy is developing. It's that key 1,000 years, which is what he means, not the pre-cultural, cultural, not the post-cultural.
The period of semiotic creation or something like that.
Yeah, that's when everything gets worked out. And then everything after that is just repetition of a fixed stock of forms.
Let's stick on Magian for a second, because I think a lot of problems come with this part of civilizational history or this particular culture civilizational block. I said to you, maybe the Earth symbol for Magian civilization should be no symbol because it's aniconic. But then you said, well, not really, because you've got Judaism and Arabic Islam, which are aniconic or iconoclastic. But then you've got Christianity, which isn't. You've got Persian Islam, which isn't. Is there a way to refer to the particular brand and period of Christianity that we're talking about when we talk about the Middle Eastern world from 0 to 500? Would you just say Christianity without any adjectives? Just
Catholic Christianity. There's really no other way, because with Constantine making it the official religion of the Roman Empire in 330, that's right when they start having these ecumenical councils. The Council of Nicaea is the first of them. There's 7 of them in 324. So that's just, 6 years before then, after that council. And the whole point of the councils is to anathematize.
Consensus.
Yeah, consensus. And so that's when it really begins. And you start getting Christian art. It comes very uncomfortably out of the catacombs. And the catacombs are built under Rome. They're basically re-territorialized caves. It's the Magian cave again. So these poor artists have to go in there with a candle, and it's dark and it stinks. All these dead, rotting bodies, they probably put something under their noses to do this. So they want to get in, do the art, and get out quickly. And that's the birth of Christian art right there. It starts to get better after that with sarcophagi and so forth, 4th century, 5th century. Then it starts getting better and better. We start getting actual images of the crucifixion. So it takes a while to get going, but once it does, it has good momentum. And it's Catholic because the art coincides with the 7 councils. The first Council of Nicaea, 324. Then you go all the way down to the last Council of Nicaea in the 8th century, which is held then over the iconoclastic controversy in the Byzantine civilization in the 8th century, where I think it's Pope, I forget his name, but he's picking up from the influence of Islam iconoclasm, because you have to imagine in your mind's eye that the Byzantine Empire abuts Islam. They have a border in the Middle East that they're fighting over back and forth. And the Pope is wondering why Islam is so successful and why Byzantium is having so many troubles. It must be because they're aniconic. So, so let's get rid of images and see if we can emulate the success of the Arabs. And that's what he does. And it causes a huge controversy in the church versus in Rome. Rome is, of course, thoroughly iconic. And it causes the early foundations of the split, of the schism that becomes official in 1054. But so that's iconoclasm was a big problem with the Byzantine church.
I think,
of course, they lost. The iconoclasts lost because the icons are such a central, important part of Byzantine Christianity. They have like a magical efficacy that you can't deny. So,
Yeah, and I mean, we could say Catholic, but that's almost misleading because Catholicism, in a sense, only became a thing when Protestantism became a thing.
Protestantism is aniconic as well. That's interesting. Yeah. A Western version of aniconism.
Right. Oliver Cromwell as Muhammad, I think.
Exactly.
I think that's the homology, right?
Yeah.
We might just say Christianity, mere Christianity, pre-schismatic Christianity or something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got Judaism and Arabic Islam, which are aniconic, Christianity and Persian Islam, which are iconic. Okay. So you would say those are the 4 major subcultures of Magian civilization.
Within the Magian. 5 counting Byzantium.
I had Byzantine and then I deleted it because I thought maybe it's confusion, because I wrote down in my notes 2 aniconic, 3 iconic, with Christianity, Persian Islam, and then Byzantine. But this is what I want to talk about a little bit. So I was going to keep going through civilizations. And when I got to the more modern period, I was going to identify Western civilization. And then I was going to ask you, if you consider Byzantine civilization its own civilization.
Toynbee does.
Right. So Toynbee does that, but Spengler does not. Spengler treats it as
Spengler
part
does
of
not.
Magian civilization. And his main reason for that, you have said, is that its architecture is cavernous. The quintessential example being Hagia Sophia.
Hagia Sophia, yeah. The more I've been thinking about it lately, the more I think Spengler's probably correct, that because you do have that architecture, the dome, and most of Byzantine architecture is really just sort of variations on the mosque theme. And the Russians picked that up from them initially. So there's that. They're speaking Greek. It's almost like they're let's say the westernmost extension of the Magian Christianity, the westernmost, before Russia picks it up and before the West picks it up, because it had an almost equal influence on both the West and Russia, pseudomorphically in both cases. Russia wanted to be Byzantium, and so they pick up the title of Tsar from them. That comes from the Byzantine world. And Charlemagne, when he's establishing his palace at Aachen, the palace itself is derived from San Vitale in Ravenna, which was built by Justinian as like a westernmost sort of Byzantine / mosque thing. So there's a pseudomorphosis there.
Right.
And Charlemagne and the Pope, Pope Leo in this case, they want to emulate the power of the emperor, because the West no longer has an emperor. And so when he crowns Charlemagne in 800, crowns him emperor of the Frankish Empire, now they've got an emperor. And so they're suffering from sort of emperor envy. They want to rival the emperor, although the emperor at that time was a woman, Irene, which they regarded as, you can't have a female emperor. So now we have with Charlemagne the legitimate emperor of Christianity. The first great emperor since the last of the Roman emperors in 476, Romulus Augustulus. So it really does seem to be Magian to me. The more that I think about it, think about Asia Minor, and the position there of Constantinople, at the Straits, the Bosphorus, the entry into the Black Sea, that the whole world does seem to be a tentacle, let's say, of the Magian. The Catholics clearly are thinking of Byzantium as an equal and opposite rival. All the councils take place right around the Bosphorus, the Straits there. And they're trying to see, they spend centuries trying to see if they can come to agreement, but they can't. Gotcha. They don't ever. Greek versus Latin. Linguistically, no. Politically, no. Because you have to think, too, that with regard to the Byzantine emperor, he kind of is similar to the caliph in that he is both head of state and head of the church. He's kind of like a caliph. And the caliph is the same thing, whereas in the West, we have that separation of emperor.
Separation, right. That helps make sense of the fact that even down to this day, you have a more maybe democratic tradition in Western Europe, and in the Orthodox world, less democracy and less of a tradition of the head of state being accountable to something outside of himself, right?
Yep. You can't just do as you please unilaterally in the West. There's always accountability. Not so in Byzantium and not so in Russia. They've picked up in their emulation from Byzantium this autocratic idea. And they do have a separation. The patriarch, who's currently Patriarch Kirill, and Putin, they're separate. But in this case, the church defers to the state.
The church defers, whereas for much of medieval history and Latin Christendom, like political leaders had to defer to the Pope. In fact, the classic example that actually Francis Fukuyama likes to talk about is the road to Canossa. Are you familiar with this historical event? The Holy Roman Emperor, it was the investiture controversy.
That's Gregory the Seventh.
Right. Pope Gregory the Seventh excommunicated Henry the Fourth or something like that.
Yeah, Henry the Fourth, right. It's about 1085 for viewers.
The excommunication by the Pope mattered enough that Henry the Fourth basically prostrated himself in a sense before the Pope. He walked to Canossa. I think it was the winter. He stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days. And finally the Pope brought him back into the fold.
What's interesting about that is that it was all over lay investiture because Henry III, and back further, Otto the Great, actually, this starts with Otto the Great, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, who all the power is arrogated to him, not the Pope, and he retains the right to basically veto or not whoever's going to come up for election as Pope. He retains that right. So there's this power struggle. And then by the time you get to, and that's in 970, Otto dies in 970. So like a century later, then it catches up to him because Henry IV the third was a very powerful emperor and was doing this lay investiture where he could basically decide. And then,
bishops.
Bishops. Right. So then Gregory comes in. He says, "No, we're not doing that. You are going to kiss my ring, not the other way around." And so that whole power struggle happened then with Henry IV going to Canossa. And but the funny thing is that he got the power back, but it backfired on him because he invited the Normans in to fight the Germans when they went into Italy. And the Normans came in, they fought the Germans, but they also sacked Rome and chased Pope Gregory out, and he died. So the whole thing boomeranged on him. But that's the way it goes in power struggles.
Francis Fukuyama, he defines a modern political system as a political system that has three components: an effective state, meaning a meritocratic, impersonal, capable state, capable of discharging its duties effectively across the entire national or imperial territory. Rule of law, meaning the people at the top of the state, whether it's a monarch or some other kind of government, do not simply do whatever they want and those are the rules. Rather, they are accountable to some set of rules outside their own personal wishes, desires, etc. So effective state, rule of law, and then finally democracy, or what he calls democratic accountability. But then he tries to understand where each of these components of a modern political system come from, like what historical forces brought them into being. And he argues that China has the first modern state, actually going back to the Han Dynasty, if I'm not mistaken. The reason I'm bringing this up is that Francis Fukuyama thinks that the origin of rule of law globally is the existence of a transcendental religion to which the sovereign is accountable. And he always brings up Henry IV barefoot in the snow outside the castle at Canossa to illustrate or to vivify this process at work in the case of Western civilization. And he thinks that one reason why to this day, or maybe the main reason why to this day, China doesn't have the same tradition and institutions of rule of law is that, as you and I have discussed, there is no transcendental religion in China.
Russia is the same. Russia and China are the same that way.
Yeah. Okay, so we would say that really there are 5 subcultures of Magian civilization: Judaism and Arabic Islam, the aniconic ones, and then we might say Catholic Christianity, Greek Byzantine Christianity, and Persian Islam are the iconic ones.
And then we have all the troubling sub-Christianities, the Nestorian Christianity that goes east, that goes across the Silk Road and gets exported east. It's an Eastern, and then we have the Monophysites, who mostly hang out in Africa, down the Nile. And then we also have the Arian heresy, Arian as in Bishop Arius, not Indo-Aryan, Bishop Arius, which is a heresy because it demotes Christ from God. They're not on the same plane. Right. God is higher, Christ is a subordinate being. But it kind of hints at polytheism a bit.
Right.
So the Germans,
it's too polytheistic, yeah.
Yeah, the Germans, the Visigoths in Spain picked it up, and the Ostrogoths in Italy and the Crimea, they were also on the Crimea, pick it up. So whereas Clovis, who founds the Merovingian dynasty, is the first in the West to really import, other than the Irish, of course, to import Catholic Christianity, and then he makes the Frankish kingdom that he builds Catholic, not Arian. So that changed things a bit. But yeah, so we have all these troubling sub-Christianities. Yeah. If we wanted to get Toynbean about it, we would overanalyze them.
I guess we could say like the 5 we mentioned are the 5 really big ones.
Yeah, the ones that matter. Yeah.
By the way, it really does take mental gymnastics to argue that Catholicism, at least in some of its forms, is monotheistic. You know?
Well, I'm 3 troubling beings.
Yes, right. And then Mary and saints,
the angels, like
the angels.
It's kind of polytheism disguised as monotheism, if you think about it enough.
Which is another way of thinking of almost the aniconic iconic distinction. Puritanism and Islam are much more obviously monotheistic, and Judaism, right?
Yep.
Okay,
they're Puritan because they want to get back to that core, that monotheistic core. you guys have lost this. We want to get back to the original idea, just one God.
Okay, so we talked about the fact that the Western world, despite being pretty Christian to this day, is not part of Magian civilization. Rather, Christianity is a Magian pseudomorphosis on the Spenglerian account. And I think you're pretty sympathetic to that. Although, as we've discussed, the West has not shaken Christianity off as China shook off Mahayana Buddhism. So in that sense, it's like a deeper or more effective pseudomorphosis or something.
It is part of its identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really got down deep into the Western psyche.
Why are the Turks not part of Magian civilization? Was
I
Islam?
think of them as part. No,
Oh, you do?
Now that you mentioned it, yeah. So we actually have 6. I forgot about the Turks. So we have 6 subcultures with the Magian. I think of them as part of it. And Spengler does as well on his timeline. I checked. But Toynbee doesn't. So difference there. So
for Spengler, then, the Ottomans sacking Constantinople would not be an alien universal state. We're still in Magian world here.
It's within the Magian world.
Yeah.
That's taking
interesting
for him. Yeah.
Interesting. Right. Okay.
And he regards both Byzantium and the Ottomans as late stage cosmopolitan world city phenomena, especially Byzantium, which he regards as a decadent cosmopolis, very sophisticated, multilingual, huge, cosmopolitan, urban. It fits into his model as a late world city, a megalopolis. Same thing with the Turks, the Ottoman Turks.
Islam is not a Magian pseudomorphosis for the barbarian Seljuk Turks.
No, and I think that the Ottoman Empire is Islam's universal state. I think of them as equivalent to the Romans.
Right. It's fascinating. So now that I think about it, I'm just realizing that evidence for Spengler's suggestion that Islam is really the telos of Magian civilization is the fact that all of the 3 demographics, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, end up dominated by Islam, right? Or at least to this day.
3 different ethnicities, Indo-Aryan, Arabic, and Seljuk Turk.
All completely Muslim. Islam is like the flower of Magian civilization in the Spenglerian framework, right? That basic fact that these major and disparate ethnicities all converge on Islam. Different forms of it, but still. Okay, so Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, classical, Magian, and now I think we've had a good discussion about what exactly Magian is. A good, at least, introductory discussion going a little bit deeper about what exactly Magian is. And I think at least our current model has 6 subcultures.
We're up to 6 primary subcultures for the Magian. Yeah.
Judaism, Arabic Islam, Catholic Christianity, Byzantine Christianity, Persian Islam, and Turkish.
There you go.
0 to the present. Okay, then Mesoamerican. And we're going to come back to this one, but for right now, let's just say 200 AD.
For the classic period, the anthropologists say 250 AD to 900. Spengler pretty much agrees with that. I looked up the pages. He does actually have a couple pages on it based on the archaeology that he had available to him at the time. It fits pretty well. He just didn't know about the Olmecs. He says, so we have 200 corresponding really to the springtime for this civilization. And there must have been a lot of pre-culture stuff before that, he says, but it doesn't say anything about it, obviously, because he didn't know. But so he generally agrees with that date of 200 AD as the springtime.
And obviously Mesoamerican civilization is dead now.
Dead and gone, like Egypt just totally vanished.
Well, I would compare it, I think, to Mesopotamian. It's conquest and absorption.
Yeah, but that's a better comparison than Egypt, yeah.
Specifically, I would say it's the Epimethean south of Western civilization conquering and absorbing Mesoamerican civilization, creating a mestizo Catholic, but death-accepting, ancestor-mimetic Latin American culture. It would be too broad to say that it was conquered and absorbed by Western civilization. It was conquered and absorbed by the Epimethean south of Western civilization, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got Magian, Mesoamerican, you got the Inca Empire, also dead, conquest and absorption. Epimethean south of Western civilization conquers and absorbs the Incan Empire. giving rise to a mestizo Catholic Latin American civilization. There, I don't know if Andean Latin America is as death accepting as Mexico, for example. Mexico I'm more familiar with, and there the Day of the Dead is very important. And even in the United States, I mean, so many Mexican restaurants have skeletons dancing on the walls. So conquest and absorption is maybe the most common form of civilizational death so far. We've got Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, and Incan. Okay, Western civilization. This is something like Latin Christendom mixed with Hellenic and Germanic Celtic to give rise to the amalgam that we inhabit. Birth year 900 AD, still alive, hasn't died. Although we're doing everything we can. Okay, so Byzantine is not its own civilization. So I'm going to X that out. That's part of Magian. I'm glad. Fewer is better. Occam's razor.
I think so
okay.
Too.
Now, finally, Russian. This is our last one. 1900 to the present, according to you. If Byzantine is Greek Christendom and Western is Latin Christendom, Russian, maybe one synonym for it would be Slavic Christendom, the third Rome, just like Byzantine was the second Rome. You've written this really interesting essay on your Substack, placing Putin in historical context. So in your view, the Russian springtime commenced around the year 1900. So Russia is very early in its high civilizational arc. And then you have all of these homologies. So if we're comparing Russian civilization to Faustian civilization, Ivan III is Clovis. That is, Ivan III consolidated Russia, the first national sovereign or the first Russian sovereign. Similarly, Clovis consolidated the Franks. Moving forward a few centuries, Peter the Great is Charlemagne. And you can elaborate on the analogies if you'd like. I thought Dostoevsky might be something like the author of the Eddas or the Song of the Nibelungs or something.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Putin is Otto the Great, restoring the fragmented Slavic Imperium, or trying to restore the fragmented Slavic Imperium. It's looking a little shaky, but as Otto the Great restored much of the Carolingian Empire that fragmented in the 9th century. One question that occurred to me at some point was, why is Russian Orthodox Christianity not another part of Magian civilization? How do we know that it's its own thing? And also, like, is Orthodox Christianity a pseudomorphosis for the Russians?
Yeah, I do think it is pseudomorphic in the exact way that Christianity was pseudomorphic for us, that Russia has a unique Slavic identity that's different from that pseudomorphic overlay from Byzantium, the same way it is for us with our, metaphysics of the individuality. We talked about the separation, the Scandinavian separation about the time of the Clovis, the Merovingians, 480 AD, and they separate the pronoun from the verb. The guy who writes on the horn, I, Fergelmer, made this horn. So that's already a very clear and strong identity that Christianity comes along and pseudomorphically overlays on top of that. I think something similar has happened with Russia. There's been a pseudomorphic identity that because of their emulation of Byzantium. And you have to remember when Kiev and Rus got started in 880, and it lasts from 880 to 1240. The Mongol invasions put an end to it. But Kiev and Rus wasn't literate. It wasn't particularly sophisticated. It's still kind of equivalent to our barbarian war bands, Volkerwanderung stage. So they really were looking up to Byzantium as this is, just to the south of them across the Black Sea. This is where it all is. This is where art and literature and culture, they just emulated it like a young kid with an elder brother. So they wanted to be Byzantium. So they then Vladimir in 980 says, okay, we're going to be Byzantine, or rather Orthodox Christians. This is the official religion. So, but it is a pseudomorphosis. And you can tell when you look at the architecture from Kiev and Rus, and there's a lot of it, it basically copies Byzantine architecture. It's pretty much the same forms, kind of the cavern, except that they have this thing where they have the cupolas. They have a whole bunch of cupolas where it's a little different than with Byzantine architecture, like with Hagia Sophia. It's just one cavern. With the Russians and all the different cupolas with the onion shape to them have multiple caverns in a certain way, and they deny verticality with the onion just sort of. It's not like a Gothic spire, which is already prefiguring a rocket, shooting straight up. It's like a hillock on the vast, endless plain. So Spengler says the symbol for Russia is the vast, endless plain. It's endless and metaphysically limitless, but it denies verticality. And he says that even look at the Russian word for heaven, nebo. It starts with an N. It's a negative. There just isn't a vertical sense there. And he's probably right about this. When you think about Russian architecture, even if you think about something like the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, or you think about the layout of the Kremlin, it's very horizontal, these structures. They're very horizontal. So in a certain sense, the verticality of their churches, like with St. Basil's, is a Magian holdover. It's the verticality. The Magian is still, they have the dome, but it's the vast dome that goes up and encompasses and encloses. So I think it is a Byzantine pseudomorphosis, Magian Byzantine pseudomorphosis, that they may or may not ever break out of, kind of like the West, where we never really did break out of our Christian pseudomorphosis. We just sort of accepted it, transformed it, made it ours, combined the Scandinavian cult of the metaphysics of the individual as a unique species together with the collectivism and the group consensus emphasis of Christianity. And we just made it work as best we could until it splintered apart with the Reformation and so forth. But we are still Christian, and we still think of ourselves as Christian. I think that even the atheists among us still think of this civilization as basically a Christian civilization.
Are you familiar with Tom Holland's book, Dominion?
I've heard of it, but no.
It's a very long book, but well worth the read. And the thesis is precisely that no aspect of Western civilization has been untouched by Christianity. Even Voltaire was deeply Christian as he railed against the priests.
Yeah, so I think of Russia in that same way. It's probably going to be permanent with them, Orthodox Christianity. I don't think they're ever going to shed that. They'll integrate it the same way we did,
There might be room for us to do some theorizing about different kinds of pseudomorphoses, right?
Yeah, maybe there are different kinds. Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
You should zero in on that. Maybe there's different species of pseudomorphism.
With the big example we've talked about being Mahayana Buddhism as the kind you shake off, like a more superficial pseudomorphosis and a deeper pseudomorphosis, right?
Probably, why? Now that I'm thinking about with China, why they shook it off easily? Because when Mahayana Buddhism went to China was already, 1,000 years old by that point?
Right.
It wasn't there at the inception the way it is in Russia.
Right. If something is sort of embryonic and you throw some element in, that is going to be part of what emerges.
You're not going to get rid of that DNA. It's going to be part of the embryo and its entire life. Whereas if it's later on in the life cycle, you can get rid of it much easier because it's not so rooted and bound in the organism of the culture, its metabolism, let's say. So it's probably permanent with Russia. And as Spengler says in The Decline of the West, here we have a third great transformation of Christianity that will extend it well into the future. That's what he says in there. So he's probably right. But knowing that, so in the essay, so Spengler makes the comparison with Clovis in 480, uniting the Franks.
He does. Okay.
And expanding.
That's right.
Territory, with Ivan the Third, Ivan the Great, not the Terrible, the Great in 1480. So those dates are easy to remember, 480 and 1480, because they rhyme. With him conquering Novgorod, which is not just a town, but a whole principality to the north, conquers all that, he takes Tver, which had been a rival state, and then to the south takes back most of Kiev and Rus that the Mongols had taken away. So it's this huge expansion, kind of similar to the way it is with Clovis and the Franks. And then you go down the timeline of, 2 or 3 centuries to get to Charlemagne and Peter the Great. So Charlemagne then imports a huge pseudomorphosis, a Western pseudomorphosis, builds St. Petersburg, and it's all copied on Baroque architecture, Western Baroque architecture. He imports all these Italian architects, French landscape gardeners, brings in art and science that's modeled on the West. So it's total pseudomorphosis. It is, I suppose that it was a necessary thing and a good thing for Russia because it set up new standards of literacy that made possible a century later all the great Russian writers, starting with Pushkin in the 1820s and going down to Dostoevsky. That would not have happened without that. So I think it was a necessary thing for them to do. And then same thing with Charlemagne, importing both a classical pseudomorphosis and trying to revive the Roman Empire with the Frankish Empire, and then also the Magian Byzantine pseudomorphosis, copying Byzantine church forms and so forth. But he did raise the standards of literacy. He brought in and this guy could not read. This
Right.
says something about this guy. He was illiterate. He couldn't read. He struggled forever with learning how to sign his name and could never figure out how to do it. But he loved learning and he loved intellectuals, and he's just importing all of these great intellectuals from all over Europe, from Ireland, from England, from Spain, from, one great intellectual after the next. If you had intellectual fame around the year 800, chances are Charlemagne was going to call you to his court, and you'd go because you could become a superstar. And these guys were, especially Alcuin of York, which was like his right-hand man, who single-handedly raised the standards of literacy. They founded a school there, and Alcuin almost restored the Latin language to its perfection, because over the centuries, the copyists had made so many errors. Alcuin's job was to clean up those errors, so he handed Charlemagne a fresh translation of the Bible for error-free. So the two are homologous, parallel, Charlemagne and Peter the Great. And then so I thought, well, let's go down the timeline a few centuries more and see, like, if the springtime is around 1900, because and you have to infer that from him saying that if Dostoevsky had written a life of Christ as he had intended to, then it would have been a true, authentic gospel. Well, if that's the case, then 1900, Dostoevsky's like 1860s, close enough to 1900 must correspond to the year zero. The writing of the Gospels take place around 65 AD. So you infer that. So you go a century. So they're a century into their springtime, and where are we at? A century beyond that point in the West was Otto the Great. 950, 60, starts trying to rebuild the Frankish Empire by creating the Holy Roman Empire, minus the Franks, but everything else. It looks to me like Putin sort of is very, suspiciously close to Otto the Great, and his idea of restoring what was lost when the Soviet Union, collapsed, and he lost all the independent Soviet republics.
Right. I mean, he's been reacquiring. Let's go through them.
Crimea,
right? Crimea,
parts of
Georgia,
Kazakhstan, and Belarus are in alliance with them.
Belarus is a vassal state of Russia at this point. Yeah,
vassal states, and Kazakhstan as well. He can't touch the Baltic states because they're in NATO, so he has to let those go. But I don't think he cares.
He may have miscalculated with Ukraine, setting aside one's views on the invasion, etc. It looks to me like he may have set his sights too high.
I thought he was just going to take the Donbass region, because Zelensky was willing to let them go anyway.
Right.
They're Russian speaking, they're pro-Russian and so forth. I thought he was just going to take that. It surprised me, this full scale, all out. No, I'm taking the whole fucking thing.
Well, first of all, you're in very good company. I think very few people predicted that he would do what he ended up doing. But also, I do think that he had bad information in this case. He did not anticipate the degree of Ukrainian resistance. He did not realize the extent to which Ukrainians do not want to be subjugated by Russia. It's interesting, a kind of political universal is that leaders get in these epistemic bubbles. Wishful thinking is a real phenomenon. It is gratifying to hear people tell you that things are as you would wish them to be. And very often, if someone tells you that things are different from what you would wish them to be, you get mad at the messenger, right? And so I think one thing that happens is very powerful individuals, they punish people who deliver bad news to them, and they weed out the people who deliver bad news. Then only good news comes to them. Problem is, it may not be true. And I think that may have happened in this case. He's getting a lot of bad information about Ukraine from the Foreign Intelligence Division of the FSB, the 5th Division, I think it's called.
Well, let's hope it doesn't get escalate. That's my one fear at this point, that if the U.S. gets involved, or NATO, it could go out of control.
Right, because Zelensky is asking Congress to close the skies, but that would risk
an act of war. That's an act of war. So, the whole thing is it's a mess. But now we're stuck with it, and we have to live through it. So whatever happens.
Okay, so this has actually been good. This has been really helpful for me because we've gone through the major high civilizations. That is the non-satellite ones, right? Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, classical, that is Greco-Roman, Magian, Mesoamerican, Incan, Western or Faustian, and then Russian. I think that covers it. That's really helpful modeling. We've also typologized ways of dying, and it turns out that conquest and absorption seems to be the most common. Now, I have all these other questions about Mesoamerican civilization, and I know you did some preparation for that. What I'm thinking is, do you want to do one more hour tomorrow and we could cover that stuff?
yeah, we could sort of zero in on Mesoamerican civilization because there's a lot there to talk about.